Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. And I think recently during the constitutional amendment in Cameroon, Paul Biya also made the argument that term limits may be undemocratic. So long as the people continue to elect you, that term limits are undemocratic. I would like for you to answer that question from the point of view of the importance of alternance in government on creating stable institutions.
It is very self-serving for a leader who is an incumbent to amend the constitution of the country so as to perpetuate himself in power. Part of the issue with the debate on term limits is that if a president were to undertake a constitutional amendment from which he would not benefit, then people would have a more fair-minded approach in analyzing whether this amendment is to help strengthen institutions in the country or whether it's to serve the benefit of the individual. The problem is that when such amendment is crafted in a way as to benefit the individual, all of the arguments about as long as the people want don't really count. And part of the fear for me is that when you start tinkering with the constitution of the country, everything else pales in comparison. Locking up a few journalists from time to time, getting monies from the coffers, getting 40% cuts over deals behind closed doors, those things pale in comparison because you've started at the very top of the one thing that could bind everybody together. In the early 90s, going back to the question of transitions in Africa, I still remember very vividly Dr. Banda Kazumu Banda, who was president for life in Malawi. It was written into the constitution of Malawi that he would be president for life. And every time he was pushed on the question, he would say, the people of Malawi want me to be their president. And increasingly, as he was being pushed, some people thought of taking him on a bait and say, why don't you consult the people in an open process with elections that were well conducted with the secret ballot and really see whether these people really want you to be president for life? Of course, there was a lot more to it than just trying to convince. But ultimately, when Malawi organized a referendum on the question of whether Kazumu Banda should remain president for life, he lost by 67%. He lost by 67% because the people of Malawi had the opportunity to express their views in a secret ballot, and they spoke very loudly. And so every time that you see a leader saying the people want me, you take that with a grain of salt. We are all human. And I feel that things that a leader cannot accomplish in 15, 20 years, you're not going to be able to accomplish in 25 or 30. And I think that for emerging democracies on the African continent, it is important to have term limits. Because come to think of it, there is no school for democracy. There's no school for a good election. There is no case where you're going to go into a country like Cameroon, get 18 million Cameroonians, put them through a crash program, and they all come out with certificates as Democrats. People are going to become Democrats as they practice democracy. And if, as a leader, you deprive them of the opportunity to practice democracy, invariably, 10, 20 years down the road, you're going to see them acting the same way. And I think that the countries that we see in Africa prospering, both on the economic front as well as on the political front, are countries that have allowed their citizens to get this opportunity to exercise their votes and to be able to change political leadership through the electoral process. And one of my fears is that when you tinker with the Constitution, with electoral laws, you end up giving citizens the impression that political power will never change hands through the ballot process. And that is a very slippery slope, especially for our weak and fragile countries.
How do you see, most of us have been well endowed, we've traveled a lot, we've seen different communities, we understand human interaction a lot at a higher level. How do we transfer that from this knowledge to the local people, they buy and sell themselves every day, who work every day and are looking for just mere sustenance?
I am heartened by the political sophistication of the ordinary African. Despite what some organizations may say or some people may write, the ordinary African is very sophisticated. Most of the time, he or she is just asking for an opportunity to be able to express themselves. And the people at the grassroots level, they understand those nuances. What has happened, unfortunately, in some of our countries is that the environment has become so hostile that independent thinking is squashed. But if you create an enabling environment, you'll be amazed by how much talent we have at the grassroots level. Let's look at what happened in Cameroon in 2008, the demonstrations in Cameroon in 2008. Those demonstrations were an exhibition of the level of frustration by the ordinary people, the grassroots, buy and sell them, as we would call them sometimes, the unemployed for the most part, who acted out their frustrations because they thought no one was listening to them and they had grievances to air. You know, in the psychology of politics, people don't rise up because their conditions are bad. People rise up because they believe that by rising up, their conditions will be better. You know, for you guys in the scientific world, I'll use the analogy of the frog and water, or the frog in hot water. If you drop a frog in water of a very high temperature, it could die. But if you put the frog in water that's cold and you raise the temperature incrementally, the frog would adjust to the temperature of the water. And so by human nature, our survival instinct helps us adjust to whatever difficulties we can face. That's why people become very stoic, and they live sometimes under autocratic regimes, because they learn to survive. But once you show them an opportunity, once there's a sense, some level of hope, that by rising up their situations could be improved upon, people will rise up. That's why people stood up in the early 90s for change in Cameroon. It wasn't because all of a sudden between 1988 and 1990 their lives had deteriorated so badly. In fact, some of the best years in Cameroon in terms of economic statistics were between 1982 and 1984 in terms of economic growth and opportunities. And so the 80s, now when we look back at the 80s were not that bad. But the reason that people were so mobilized in the 90s was because somewhere they thought that by being mobilized, their conditions would change. And so I think it's also incumbent upon us to think through viable alternatives that we can show our people, to say that your lives could be different. Because if they don't see those alternatives, survival instinct is going to require that they fold and they get along, because that's the only way to survive.